I started planning this about 3 years ago, and my intention was to build it at that time. But as usual, I got distracted by other things and put it off. But I did buy the cushions that I need for this, and not only do I need them to put on there after it's finished, but I need those to get the right size for the bench. The first step is to mark a line on the wall to the correct height. This will be the top of the bench for the underside of the cushion, and this is 17 inches off the floor. And the banquette is L-shaped, so I'm going to continue around the corner. Before this, I cut some parts from 3/4 inch plywood. I ripped them into 2.5 inch strips and then cut them to the correct length and at the right angles. And now I can start putting together the seat part. After I got the lines marked, I located the studs in both walls. I need to fasten directly to those. This is a permanent installation, so I'm also going to use a strong glue and drive in some 2.5 inch screws. With those fastened in place, I can move on to drawing more lines. These are for the top of the back of the bench. Once again, I'm going to be installing cleats here, and these need to be solidly attached because they help support the seat. The piece that I'm adding here will do two things. First, it'll build out the end for the end cap, and also it will add strength where it's needed the most. With the first side done, I did the other side in the same way, and also added the filler on the end. Then I went back out to my shop to rip more stock to add blocking to the front of the bench. This is just ordinary construction lumber, and I'm cutting it to fit in between the seat ribs. These add strength to the frame and also give me a solid place to fasten the front trim. Then back out to the shop once again to cut the seat material. This is 3/4 inch plywood, and this gets glued solidly to the frame and adds a lot of strength. The offcut that I had from the sheet wasn't wide enough to get the second piece, so I'm going to cut a strip to make up the difference and glue that onto the edge. I'm using biscuits to line up and reinforce the joints. I got a couple more things to do before I can install the back panels for the bench. And the piece that I'm cutting here is cut at the same angle as the back. And this is blocking that will help support the sheet that will be the back of the bench. And I also cut another piece to go up at the top at the same angle. I'm not going to be putting any padding on the back. It's going to be exposed, so I'm using 1/2-inch maple veneer plywood. And here I'm cutting the shorter piece at that same angle that I had the saw set to before, so that the edge of the plywood sits down tight against the plywood on the bottom. And I can cut it to length and clean it up with a little light sanding. And once again, I'm going to be using construction adhesive to glue this panel in place, and driving in some pins to hold it until the glue sets. Now I can move over to the other side, and once again I need to add some blocking to help support the end of that piece. And when I got that done, I'm using my homemade sliding T-bevel to measure the angle at the back. Even though I know that it's 9 degrees, I like to check it to make sure, and that gives me the best chance of cutting a tight joint. I filmed all this, but I sped it up quite a bit so you can see what happens when you don't take the time to clean up your shop before you start a project. So here I am marking that angle on the back. That'll give me a guide to cut to, and I'm also using the T-bevel to set the miter saw to make the cut. And as it turns out, it was actually 9 degrees. Now here, what I'm doing is I'm recutting that edge that I cut roughly by cutting the whole sheet, and more light sanding before I can bring it in and see how the joint fits. It looks pretty good, but it can be improved by back beveling it slightly with a hand plane. Get it in there again, and tight, really nice. And now I left it long to mark the end, actually held in place, and I brought that out and cut it off. And now I can glue and pin it in place like I did with the first one. And then I let that glue dry for a few hours, and now I can plane down the top to make it flush with the top of the framing. Before going any further, I put on the first coat of water-based polyurethane and let it dry overnight. The next day I started trimming it with the solid maple. I'm starting on the end here with the widest piece. I actually had to glue this up, and I want this to stick out a little bit past the surface of the back, and I'm using a scribe stick up against the wood to do that. The wood strip is a spacer, but it also helps to protect the back panel that I just finished from getting marked up from scribing the angle. And now I can bring that piece out to the shop and make 3 cuts on it. First is to cut it to the correct width, and then cut it to the correct length that I marked on the top. And then there's a taper on here as well. And probably one of my more favorite ways of cutting a taper is to cut a scrap plywood that's wider than the piece I need to cut, and then use double-side tape to hold that plywood in place on the line that I already marked. And that will space it at exactly the right distance to make the cut. And then I can do the same on the second piece for the other end of the bench that I also marked out. I want to use dominoes in these joints in the corner, and they'll add some strength to that corner and also strengthen the bench right at the end there, which is, as I said earlier, very important with a floating bench that doesn't have any legs. And once again, I'm using polyurethane construction adhesive to glue these parts in place. Once I got that on, I can do the top, and this needs to be scribed. I didn't film any of the scribing, but you can see me marking it here. And when I had the piece on top, I noticed that my framing was a little bit high there, so I took the time to trim it down with my chisel. This doesn't have to be perfect because it's going to be covered with solid maple. Then I can cut it to length and get it glued down and pinned in place. And I did the same on the other side in exactly the same way, except this time I didn't need to trim down any of the framing. And then I've got solid wood at the front of the bench as well. Also, I'm using dominoes here to reinforce those joints. The dominoes will keep the joint in line as well as adding strength. One of the skills that you need to develop if you're building things in place is your scribing skills, because almost everything that goes together will need to be scribed to fit into the piece that you just put on. And that's certainly the case here. I had to mark it, bring it back up to the shop, cut it, and then I brought it in, got the dominoes cut in, and then I could put that on as well. And then I got some clamps on there and I let it dry overnight. Next day I got out the sander and did some finish sanding on there to level up all the joints and round over the corners and make it all nice and clean and even. And all the vibration from the sander managed to knock a couple pieces of my sculpture off the wall, and they fell down, interrupting my filming here. Luckily it didn't hit me in the head. And then once again, I can break out the paintbrush and get 3 coats of water-based poly on here to finish it up. I let that dry and then I put the cushions on, and this is what the final result looks like.